Imagine walking outside on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, looking out at the place where a 12-acre lake used to be, and seeing nothing but cracked mud, flopping fish, and a stage with a banner that reads, "Welcome to Crescent Ridge Community Lake," hanging over empty air. That's what 400 people saw the morning the HOA president held her grand opening on my private property. She'd spent 6 months taking over my land, ignoring my deed, fining me for protecting my own shoreline, and convincing an entire county that my grandfather's lake belonged to her homeowners association. She printed flyers, she hired caterers, she invited the newspaper. She even tried to get a restraining order to keep me away from my own property during her little celebration. But what nobody in that crowd understood, not the commissioners, not the band, not Brenda in her white floral dress, was that the lake had never been a natural feature. It was a man-made impoundment, held in place by a dam my family built and a valve only I controlled. And the night before her party, I opened it. Stay right here. You're going to love how this ends. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the land. 82 acres of East Tennessee hillside, tucked between Chilhowie Mountain and the French Broad River, about 40 minutes outside Knoxville. My grandfather, Wallace Hollowell, bought it raw in 1964. Mostly red clay, oak forest, and a slow creek called Birch Run that wandered through the lowest part of the valley. He was a retired Army Corps of Engineers surveyor, and he saw something nobody else did. He saw a lake. He spent 3 years building an earthen dam across that creek. I'm talking hand-placed stone spillway, reinforced clay core packed layer by layer. He diverted the flow, shaped the banks, and let the valley fill slowly over 2 seasons. By 1967, he had a 12-acre private lake sitting right in the heart of his property, crystal clear in summer, ice-rimmed in winter, and full of more fish than any man could catch in a lifetime. He stocked it himself with largemouth bass, channel catfish, and bluegill from a hatchery in Maryville, built a small dock from pressure-treated pine, put up a cabin near the ridge with a screened porch that looked straight down at the water. He even planted weeping willows along the north bank, because my grandmother loved the way they looked in the wind. That lake was his masterpiece. It was the thing he was most proud of in his whole life, more than his military service, more than his career, more than anything he ever bought or built. When the Crescent Ridge subdivision got built in the early 80s, the developer bought the parcels on the east side of Granddad's land. People moved in. They could see the lake from their back decks. Over the years, Granddad, being the kind of man he was, let a few neighbors walk down and fish. No formal agreement, no written permission, just a handshake and a nod. He liked the company. He passed in 2019, and the property came to me. I'd just gone through a divorce, and honestly, moving on to that land felt like coming home. I'm a hydraulic engineer by trade, so I understood exactly what Granddad had built. I maintained the dam, cleared the spillway, kept the valve functional. I even reinforced the downstream culvert the first winter. The HOA at Crescent Ridge had about 140 homes by then, and the president was a woman named Brenda Calloway. Blonde, heavy-set, loud. The kind of person who introduces herself by her title before her name. She wore oversized sunglasses and clipboard carried through every neighborhood meeting like she was running a military tribunal. Her husband, Dwayne, flipped houses in the area and sat on the county planning commission. Together, they acted like Crescent Ridge was their personal kingdom. The first time I saw Brenda in action was at a neighborhood 4th of July picnic that first summer. She stood at the entrance of the community clubhouse with a clipboard, checking off names as families walked in, and actually turned away a couple because the wife's guest parking pass had expired 2 days earlier. Turned them away from a picnic. The husband stood there holding a casserole dish, and Brenda told him, "Rules are rules. You can reapply for a guest pass on Monday." I remember thinking, this woman doesn't just enforce rules, she collects them like weapons. Within a month of me moving in, she showed up at my front porch with a welcome basket and a complaint. She told me the hedgerow along my eastern fence line was overgrown and unsightly. I told her politely that my property wasn't part of the HOA. She smiled, adjusted her sunglasses, and said, "We'll see about that." That should have been my first warning, but I was tired, I was grieving, and I just wanted to fish. There was a bench down by the dock that Granddad built from locust wood. It had weathered to a silvery gray, and the slats were smooth from years of sitting. I spent most evenings there that first fall, watching the water change color as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Some nights the lake went orange, then copper, then black. The bullfrogs would start up, and then the whippoorwills, and I'd sit there thinking about all the evenings Granddad must have done the same thing. That lake wasn't just property to me. It was the last place on earth where I still felt connected to someone who was gone. The trouble started in spring. I walked down to the lake one morning and found 3 aluminum signs staked along the eastern shore, the side visible from the Crescent Ridge homes. Each one read, "Crescent Ridge Community Lake. HOA members welcome. Guests must register at the office." They even had the HOA logo printed in full color. I pulled every single one of them out of the ground, carried them to Brenda's front porch, and left them leaning against her door with a note that said, "This is private property. Please don't do this again." 2 days later, I found 6 new signs. These ones were bolted to pressure-treated posts, cemented into the ground, on my land. I could smell the fresh concrete from 20 feet away. That's the thing about people like Brenda. You give them a polite correction, and they hear an invitation to push harder. I sent a certified letter to the HOA board. I attached my deed, a property survey from 2020, and a copy of my grandfather's original land patent. I made it crystal clear. The lake, the shoreline, the dam, the access road, all of it sat within my property boundaries. The HOA had 0 jurisdiction and 0 ownership. 2 weeks later, I got a letter back. Not from a lawyer, from Brenda, on HOA letterhead. It said the lake had been utilized as a community amenity for decades, and that my attempt to restrict access was a violation of the HOA's Community Harmony Clause. The fine? $500, due in 30 days. I almost laughed, almost. But then I noticed the second page. It was a notice informing me that the HOA was beginning the process of filing an adverse use claim on the lake and surrounding shoreline. In plain English, they were trying to argue that because neighbors had been using the lake casually for years, the HOA now had a legal right to it. They were citing prescriptive easement, the legal idea that long-term open use of someone's land can sometimes create a right of access. Now, here's the legal nugget most people don't know. In Tennessee, a prescriptive easement requires continuous, open, and hostile use for at least 20 years, and the use has to be without the owner's permission. The moment you can show the owner gave casual permission, like my grandfather did, the whole claim falls apart. Permission kills prescriptive easement. Full stop. I didn't respond to the fine. I didn't argue with the adverse use notice. I just went inside, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled out a photograph of my grandfather standing at the lake with 3 neighbors in 1991, all holding fishing rods and smiling. On the back, Granddad had written in pencil, "Gave Bill, Hank, and Tom permission to fish, April 14th, 1991. That one sentence was a nuclear bomb in a legal briefcase, but I wasn't ready to use it yet. I put the photo back in the cabinet, walked down to the dock, and sat on Granddad's bench. A great blue heron was standing in the shallows near the eastern reeds, perfectly still, hunting. The evening light was turning the water bronze. Somewhere on the Crescent Ridge side, I could hear kids laughing and a lawnmower droning. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. And somewhere in the middle of all that peace, a woman with a clipboard was trying to take this from me. I watched the heron lift off, slow, heavy wing beats, and disappear over the tree line. Then I went inside, poured a glass of bourbon, and started keeping a timeline. By June, Brenda had moved past signs and letters. She called a special HOA meeting, open to all homeowners, and put a single item on the agenda: a special assessment to fund lake improvements. She wanted $15,000 from the community to build a proper dock, a small sand beach, a kayak launch, and a paved walking trail around the southern shore. All of it on my property. I wasn't invited to the meeting, obviously, but my neighbor Reggie, a retired postal worker who lived on the edge of the subdivision and had always been decent to me, recorded the whole thing on his phone and sent it to me that night. I sat at my kitchen table and watched Brenda stand in front of a projector screen, showing drone footage of my lake, my cabin in the background, while she pointed at color-coded diagrams of where the beach would go and where the trail would loop. She even had a proposed sign design: Crescent Ridge Lake, Est, 2024. Established 2024. My grandfather built that lake in 1967. The vote passed 81 to 12. 12 people had the sense to ask, wait, who actually owns that lake? The other 81 just trusted Brenda when she said the HOA's legal counsel had confirmed they had strong grounds for community use rights. 2 weeks later, a construction crew showed up at the southern end of the lake with a skid steer, a flatbed of gravel, and a stack of pressure-treated lumber. I walked down there in my work boots and asked who hired them. The foreman, a decent guy named Rick, said the Crescent Ridge HOA had contracted them to build a dock and grade a beach area. He showed me the work order. It had Brenda's signature and the HOA treasurer's signature. It did not have my signature. It did not have my permission. And it did not mention that the land belonged to me. I told Rick, calmly and clearly, that he was standing on private property and that no work had been authorized by the landowner. I showed him my driver's license and pointed at the deed notice I'd nailed to a post at the access road. His face went pale. He pulled his crew off within the hour. That afternoon, Brenda called me. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "You had no right to interfere with a contracted community project." I told her I had every right because it was my land. She said, "We'll see what the board's attorney thinks about that." I said, "I look forward to it," and I hung up. The smell of fresh-cut lumber sat in the air near the lake for days. Every time I walked past those abandoned stacks, I felt something harden inside me. Not anger, exactly. Resolve. The kind of quiet resolve that doesn't shout. It builds. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything. Every date, every letter, every sign, every conversation. I went through my phone and screenshotted every text. I printed every email. I pulled the certified mail receipts from the drawer where I'd been tossing them. I organized everything chronologically and put it all in a banker's box. My ex-wife used to say I was obsessive about documentation. She meant it as a criticism. But documentation is what happens when you know the truth, and you know you'll eventually need to prove it. I also called Reggie and asked him to send me that phone recording of the HOA meeting. He sent it that night. I played it twice on my laptop, watching Brenda point at my lake on a projector screen, and I noticed something I'd missed the first time. At the 7-minute mark, one of the homeowners in the back row, an older man with a gray beard, raised his hand and asked, "Has the actual landowner given consent for any of this?" Brenda didn't hesitate. She said, "The board's legal team has confirmed we have full authority." That was a lie. She didn't have a legal team. She had Dale Wooten, who she hadn't even hired yet. I saved the timestamp and kept building my file. By mid-July, Brenda had secured a lawyer. Not a good one, a local general practitioner named Dale Wooten, who mostly handled car accidents and DUIs. But he sent me a letter on official letterhead demanding I cease and desist from obstructing homeowner access to shared community water resources. The letter cited Tennessee water law, riparian rights, and the state's recreational use statute, and got every single one of them wrong. Here's the thing. Tennessee follows the reasonable use doctrine for water, which means a riparian landowner, the person whose land touches a body of water, has the right to use that water reasonably. But my lake wasn't a natural body of water. My grandfather created it by building a dam on a creek that ran entirely through his property. Under Tennessee law, an artificial impoundment on private land is private property. Period. The HOA had no more right to my lake than they had to my swimming pool. I didn't respond to Dale Wooten's letter directly. Instead, I hired my own attorney, a water rights specialist out of Knoxville named Faye Prescott. Faye had handled dam disputes, creek diversion cases, and riparian claims for 20 years. She read Wooten's letter, looked at me over her glasses, and said, "This is embarrassing for him. Want me to respond gently or precisely?" I said precisely. Faye sent a 12-page response. She cited the Tennessee Dam Safety Act, the state's artificial impoundment statutes, my grandfather's original Army Corps permits for the dam construction, and a 1998 state appeals court ruling that said casual recreational use of a private lake does not create a prescriptive easement if the owner gave informal permission. She attached my deed, 2 surveys, the Army Corps permit file, and that photograph of Granddad with the handwritten note on the back. Dale Wooten went silent for 3 weeks, but Brenda didn't. She went to her husband Dwayne, who sat on the county planning commission. Dwayne made a few calls. Suddenly, I started getting code enforcement visits. An inspector showed up to check my dam safety compliance. Another came to evaluate whether my access road met county fire standards. A third asked about my septic system. All in 1 week. I passed every single inspection. My dam met every TDEC standard. My road exceeded the minimum width. My septic had been serviced that spring. Every inspector left my property with nothing to write up. But the message was clear. Brenda and Dwayne were using their connections to harass me into submission. I passed every single inspection clean. But the harassment had a weight to it. It wasn't the inspections themselves. It was the message behind them. It was Brenda and Dwayne reminding me that they had connections, and that those connections could make my life uncomfortable whenever they felt like it. The third inspector, the septic guy, actually apologized before he left. He said, "Look, I don't know what's going on between you and the HOA, but I got a call from the commission office telling me to prioritize this address. I've never gotten a call like that before." I thanked him, shook his hand, and wrote down every word he'd said while his truck was still in my driveway. The taste of dust from that truck still hung in the air when I sat down on my porch and really decided, that this wasn't going to end with a letter or a phone call. This was going to end publicly, and Brenda was going to be standing right in the middle of it when it happened. That weekend, I drove out to the county clerk's office in Sevierville and pulled every document connected to my grandfather's property. The deed, the plat map, the Army Corps permit application from 1965, the dam inspection records from the 70s and 80s, and something I hadn't seen before, a detailed engineering schematic my grandfather had filed with the county in 1966, 2 years before the lake was finished. The schematic showed everything: the dam dimensions, the clay core design, the stone-lined spillway on the western side, and a 12-inch cast iron valve at the base of the dam, connected to a reinforced culvert that fed back into the original Birch Run Creek bed downstream. That valve was the key to the entire lake. Without the dam holding water back, the valley would drain through that valve and the spillway within 8 to 10 hours, depending on rainfall levels. The lake would empty like a bathtub, 12 acres of water, gone. Just a muddy basin with a few confused catfish flopping around. And here's what mattered most. That dam, that valve, that spillway, every piece of it sat on my property. I maintained it. I controlled it. It had never been transferred, deeded, or easement granted to anyone. Under Tennessee's Dam Safety Act, I had the legal authority to operate, maintain, or decommission that dam at my discretion, provided I followed proper notification procedures for downstream impact. I sat in the county clerk's office, holding that 60-year-old schematic, and for the first time in months, I smiled. The clerk, a quiet woman named Dorothy who'd been working there since the Reagan administration, asked me if I'd found what I was looking for. I said, "Ma'am, I found something better." She gave me a look like she'd heard that before. She probably had. I drove home with the schematic on the passenger seat, the windows down, and the late summer air thick with the smell of cut hay and warm asphalt. I kept glancing at that yellowed paper like it might disappear if I looked away too long. Granddad had drawn every detail by hand: the contour lines, the elevation numbers, the cross-section of the dam, the valve mechanism. His handwriting was careful, precise. The man built a lake with pencil lines and Army Corps know-how, and 60 years later, those same pencil lines were about to dismantle the biggest lie Brenda Calloway had ever told. She was planning a grand opening on a lake that existed only because my family decided to hold back a creek, and I had the legal right to let it go. I didn't rush. That's the first rule of a good counterstrike. You don't move until every piece is in position. First, I called Faye Prescott. I told her what I'd found. She pulled the relevant statutes, reviewed the dam safety protocols, and confirmed what I suspected. As the dam owner, I had the right to open the spillway valve and lower the water level at any time, for any reason, as long as I notified the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation and ensured the downstream flow wouldn't cause flooding or environmental damage. Birch Run fed into a larger creek about a mile south that could easily handle the volume. Faye helped me draft the notification letter. We filed it quietly. Second, I hired a licensed surveyor, the same firm that had done my 2020 boundary survey, to come back and place permanent, GPS-verified boundary markers along every edge of my property that bordered Crescent Ridge. I wanted steel pins in the ground, orange caps visible from 20 feet, and a certified plat on record with the county. No more ambiguity. No more, we thought this was community land. The surveyor finished in 4 days. Third, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the County Planning Commission, Dwayne Calloway's own department, asking for all permits issued for construction on or adjacent to the lake. The response came back in 11 days. 0 permits. The HOA had never applied for a single permit for the dock, the beach grading, the walking trail, or any of the signage. Every bit of improvement Brenda had ordered was unpermitted construction on private property. That alone was a code violation worth thousands in fines. Fourth, I set up additional cameras. I already had 2 trail cameras near the dam and 1 on the access road. I added 3 more. 1 covering the eastern shore where Brenda liked to stand and gesture at things, 1 at the southern beach area where the construction crew had been working, and 1 pointed directly at the spillway valve. Everything recorded to a cloud server with timestamps and GPS coordinates. If anyone touched my property again, I'd have it on video from 3 angles. Fifth, I did something I'd been wanting to do since spring. I walked down to the dam on a Tuesday evening, cleared the brush from around the valve housing, greased the handle, and tested it. The valve opened smoothly. Water began flowing through the culvert and out into the old Birch Run creek bed. I let it run for about 10 minutes, just enough to confirm the flow rate, then closed it back up. The math checked out. At full open, the lake would drain to mud level in roughly 8 to 10 hours. Finally, I waited, because Brenda was about to give me the perfect moment. By August, she had gone all in on the grand opening. Full-color flyers mailed to every address in the county, a feature in the local newspaper, the Sevier County Herald, with a photo of Brenda standing at the shoreline under the headline, "Crescent Ridge Unveils Stunning New Lake Amenity." She'd booked a catering company, rented a stage, hired a local bluegrass band, and invited the county commissioners, the mayor of Sevierville, and a reporter from the Knoxville News-Sentinel. The event was scheduled for Saturday, September 14th. She even had t-shirts printed. I saw one of those flyers tacked to the bulletin board at the hardware store in town. It said, "Grand Opening, Crescent Ridge Community Lake, Saturday, September 14th, live music, food, family fun." Below the text was a drone photo of my lake, crystal blue under the August sun. I saw one of those t-shirts on a teenager at the gas station. It had a little cartoon lake on it with the words, "Crescent Ridge, Lake Life," underneath. The kid couldn't have been more than 16. He had no idea the lake on his shirt was older than his grandmother and owned by a man who hadn't been asked a single question about any of this. I bought my gas, drove home, and pinned one of Brenda's flyers to my refrigerator, right next to the photo of Granddad holding a 6-pound bass at sunset. I looked at both of them every morning over coffee for the next 2 weeks. One reminded me of what I was protecting. The other reminded me why. The first week of September, Brenda launched her PR campaign hard. She created a Facebook group called Crescent Ridge Lake Friends and invited every homeowner in the subdivision. She posted daily updates, photos of the stage being built near the eastern shore, a menu from the catering company, a schedule of events that included a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a kayak demo, and something called Karen's Famous Cornhole Tournament. I swear I'm not making that up. She also posted a long, emotional essay about how the lake was the heart and soul of Crescent Ridge, and how she had personally fought to preserve community access against one difficult property owner who wanted to hoard a natural treasure. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who she meant. That post got 137 reactions. Most of them were angry faces, directed at me. A woman I'd never met commented, "This man should be ashamed. That lake belongs to all of us." A guy named Phil wrote, "People like him are what's wrong with this country." Another one said, "Just take it to court and force him to share." Nobody tagged me. Nobody asked my side. That's how it works when someone like Brenda controls the narrative. She doesn't need facts. She just needs volume and a Facebook group. I stayed quiet. I didn't post anything. I didn't knock on doors. I didn't argue. I just kept maintaining my property and checking my cameras and watching Brenda build a party on land she didn't own, for a lake she didn't control, using money she'd collected under false pretenses. But then Brenda did something that crossed a different kind of line. She filed a motion with the county court for a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I was threatening to interfere with a lawfully organized community event. The motion was filed by Dale Wooten, who apparently had not learned his lesson from Faye's 12-page letter. The hearing was scheduled for September 9th, 5 days before the grand opening. I showed up to court in a clean button-down shirt with Faye Prescott beside me and a banker's box full of documents. Brenda showed up in a white blazer with Dale Wooten and a folder that couldn't have been more than 10 pages thick. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Harriet Burgess, listened to both sides. Dale argued that the community had a long-standing right to enjoy the lake, and that my behavior constituted harassment of a lawful community organization. Faye presented the deed, the surveys, the Army Corps permits, the county's own zero-permit FOIA response, the photograph with Granddad's handwritten note, and a timeline of every violation the HOA had committed on my property. Judge Burgess denied the restraining order in less than 15 minutes. She told Dale Wooten, on the record, that his client had no demonstrable legal interest in the lake or the surrounding land, and that the HOA's use of community funds for construction on private property without permits was deeply concerning. She recommended Brenda consult a different attorney. Brenda walked out of that courtroom with her face the color of a ripe tomato, but she didn't cancel the grand opening. She went home and posted on Facebook. The judge ruled in our favor in spirit. The grand opening is still on. Nothing can stop this community from coming together. I read that post sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the lake. The water was so still it looked like glass. A pair of wood ducks paddled near the far shore, leaving twin V-shaped wakes that spread and dissolved into nothing. I thought about Granddad. I thought about what he'd say if he could see what his lake had become. A political prop for a woman who couldn't tell a dam from a ditch. He'd probably just shake his head and say what he always said when people got too full of themselves. The creek don't care who you think you are. I finished my coffee, watched the last light drain out of the sky. Then I walked inside, checked the weather forecast. Clear skies, no rain for 5 days, and set my alarm for 2 in the morning. The week before the grand opening was surreal. Brenda had transformed the eastern shore of my property into what looked like a small county fair. A rented stage sat on a gravel pad. Strings of Edison bulbs hung between rented poles. A portable PA system was wired to a generator. There were folding tables, a registration booth, a banner that read, "Welcome to Crescent Ridge Lake," in 3-foot letters. All of it on my land. All of it without my permission. Reggie, my neighbor, came by on Wednesday evening. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. "Garrett," he said, "I know you're in the right. Everyone with half a brain knows you're in the right. But Brenda's got a lot of people convinced this is happening. There's going to be hundreds of folks out there Saturday. Kids, families, the mayor." I told Reggie I appreciated his concern. I told him nobody was going to get hurt. And I told him that if he wanted to come watch from my cabin porch Saturday morning, he was welcome to bring a lawn chair and a thermos. He looked at me for a long second, then nodded and walked back down the hill. Thursday night, I got a hand-delivered letter from Brenda. It was written on personal stationery, not HOA letterhead, and it said, and I quote the opening line, "I hope you'll do the decent thing and stay out of sight during our celebration." She went on to say that my obsessive behavior was poisoning the spirit of this community, and that if I tried to disrupt the event, she would call the sheriff and have me removed from, and this part still makes me laugh, from my own property. I folded the letter neatly, placed it in the banker's box with everything else, and called Faye one last time. I told her the grand opening was still on. She said, "You filed the TDEC notification. Your downstream assessment is clean. Your survey is recorded. You have every right to operate your dam as you see fit." I asked if she wanted to come to the grand opening. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, and said, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Then I went to bed early. Friday night, September 13th, I ate dinner alone, grilled a steak, watched the lake through the window. The water was calm and dark, reflecting the first stars of the evening. The stage lights on the eastern shore glowed faintly, and I could hear someone testing the PA system. A man's voice echoed across the water. "Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. I washed my dishes. I dried them. I set them in the cabinet the way Granddad always did. Plates on the left, bowls on the right, mugs hanging from the hooks he'd screwed into the underside of the shelf in 1972. Some habits you inherit without even knowing it. I pulled on my work boots, laced them tight, grabbed my headlamp, and walked down to the dam. The path was familiar even in the dark. I'd walked it 100 times as a kid, following Granddad's flashlight beam through the trees, learning the shape of the land by feel. The night air smelled like damp earth and coming autumn. Crickets pulsed in the tree line. The spillway was exactly where it had always been, a stone-lined channel on the western side of the dam, half hidden by wild fern and old growth. I cleared the valve housing cover, set my headlamp to red, and put my hand on the handle. I didn't hesitate. I'd done the math. I'd filed the notifications. I'd documented everything. The TDEC had my letter on file. Faye Prescott had confirmed the legality 3 separate times. The downstream flow was safe. I turned the valve. The sound was low at first, a deep, resonant gurgle, like a giant swallowing. Then it grew, a steady, muscular rush of water pouring through the 12-inch culvert and out into the old Birch Run creek bed. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, listening to 60 years of impounded water begin to find its way back downhill. The moon was half full, and in its light I could see the surface of the lake beginning to shift, a slow, barely perceptible lowering, like someone had pulled the plug on the world's biggest bathtub. The eastern shore, where Brenda's stage and banner waited, was still 100 yards away. By morning, it would be the edge of a mud flat. I looked up at the sky. Orion was just starting to rise over the eastern ridge. Granddad taught me to find it when I was 8 years old, standing in this exact spot. "That's the hunter," he'd said. "He's patient. He waits all year, then shows up right when you need him." I turned off my headlamp, walked back up to the cabin in the dark, set my alarm for 7, and slept better than I had in months. I woke up at dawn and looked out the window. The lake was gone. Where 12 acres of blue water had shimmered the day before, there was now a vast, gently sloping basin of gray-brown mud. The exposed lake bed stretched out like a lunar landscape, cracked in places, slick in others, dotted with shallow puddles where the last water still gathered in low spots. A few fish flopped weakly near the old creek channel. The dock that Brenda's crew had started to build jutted into nothing, its pilings standing in open air like the ribs of something dead. The stage on the eastern shore sat undisturbed. The Edison bulbs still hung from their poles. The banner still read, "Welcome to Crescent Ridge Lake." But there was no lake, just an enormous, stinking mud flat where a lake used to be. I made coffee. I sat on the porch, and I waited. By 9 o'clock, the first cars started arriving. Families in SUVs, couples in trucks, kids in the back seats with towels and inflatable toys. They parked along the road that ran past the eastern boundary and walked toward the shore. And then they stopped. One by one, like dominoes in reverse, they stopped walking and just stared. The whispers started before Brenda even got there. "Where's the water? Is this a joke? Did it dry up?" A man in a volunteer's cap pulled out his phone and started recording. A woman with 2 kids turned around and left without saying a word. Brenda arrived at 9:30 in a white SUV with the HOA logo on the door. She stepped out in a floral dress and heels, clipboard in hand, sunglasses pushed up on her head. She walked toward the shoreline with the confident stride of someone who hasn't yet realized the floor has disappeared beneath her. Then she saw it, or rather, she saw the absence of it. I will never forget the sequence of expressions that crossed Brenda Calloway's face in the next 3 seconds. It was like watching someone open a Christmas present and find a tax audit inside. She stopped. She blinked. She dropped the clipboard. She turned to her husband, Dwayne, who was standing behind her with his mouth open. She turned back to the mud, and then she screamed. Not words, just a sound, high and sharp, like a tea kettle hitting its limit. By 10 o'clock, there were over 300 people standing on the ridge, looking down at the empty lake bed. The county commissioners had arrived. The reporter from the Knoxville paper was taking photos. The bluegrass band was sitting on the stage with their instruments in their laps, looking confused. The catering company was unpacking trays of pulled pork next to a lake that no longer existed. That's when I walked down the hill. I came from the west side, from my property, with Faye Prescott on my left and my surveyor, Tom Bridwell, on my right. I carried a file folder. Faye carried a briefcase. Tom carried a rolled-up plat map. Brenda saw me first. She marched toward me with fury vibrating in every step. "What did you do?" she screamed. "What the hell did you do to our lake?" I didn't raise my voice. I said, "It's not your lake, Brenda. It never was." Faye stepped forward and addressed the crowd. She introduced herself, stated her credentials, and laid it out plainly. The lake was a private artificial impoundment, created by a dam built on private land in 1967. The dam, the spillway, the valve, and the lake bed were all privately owned. The HOA had never held any legal claim to the water, the shoreline, or any access. The special assessment funds had been spent on unpermitted construction on private property. The restraining order had been denied. The county's own records confirmed 0 permits, and the landowner, me, had exercised his legal right to operate his own dam infrastructure in accordance with Tennessee law and TDEC notification procedures. The silence after she finished was the most complete silence I've ever heard outdoors. 300 people, a bluegrass band with their instruments in their laps, a catering crew holding trays of pulled pork, 2 county commissioners in khaki suits, and 1 very pale real estate developer named Dwayne, all standing in the September morning sun, staring at a mudflat, saying absolutely nothing. A crow called somewhere in the tree line. That was the only sound for about 10 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man laughed. Just one laugh, short and sharp, like a cough. And then more people started talking, and the spell broke. Then one of the commissioners, a man named Holt, turned to Dwayne Calloway and said, loud enough for the reporter to hear, "Dwayne, did your office issue any permits for this?" Dwayne's face went white. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The reporter from the Knoxville paper had her notebook out before Faye was done talking. She asked Brenda for a comment. Brenda said, "This man drained our lake out of spite." Faye corrected her calmly. "He opened a valve on his own dam, on his own property, after filing proper notification. There is no our lake." The sheriff's department arrived around 11, not because of the lake, because someone from the crowd had called about the unpermitted construction. A deputy took statements. Another deputy took photos of the abandoned dock, the gravel pad, the stage, and the banner. Faye handed him copies of the 0 permit FOIA response and the property survey. Brenda was still standing near the shore when the deputy approached her. He didn't arrest her. He handed her a card and said the county building department would be in touch. She took it without looking at it, her eyes still fixed on the empty lake bed, like she was waiting for the water to come back. Reggie was sitting on my cabin porch with a thermos of coffee, exactly where I'd told him he was welcome. He watched the whole thing unfold from up on the ridge. When I walked back up, he shook his head slowly and said, "Garrett, I've been a mailman for 31 years. I've seen a lot of people get bad news, but I have never seen someone receive a message that clear and still not understand it." We sat there together for a while, drinking coffee, watching the crowd thin out, watching the catering crew pack up trays of pulled pork that nobody had touched, watching the bluegrass band load their instruments into a van. The banner still hung over the empty basin. "Welcome to Crescent Ridge Lake." A light breeze caught it, and it flapped once, then went still. The grand opening of Crescent Ridge Community Lake lasted about 45 minutes. There was no ribbon to cut, no kayak demo, no cornhole tournament. There was just a mud flat, 300 confused people, and a woman in a floral dress slowly realizing that the empire she'd built was made of borrowed water. The fallout was swift and thorough. The county opened an investigation into the unpermitted construction on my property. The HOA's liability insurance carrier launched its own review of how community funds had been spent. Brenda Calloway was voted off the HOA board in a special election the following month. The vote was 119 to 6. Her husband Dwayne quietly resigned from the County Planning Commission 2 weeks later, after the Knoxville paper ran a follow-up article titled, "HOA President's Husband Used County Office to Pressure Landowner." Dale Wooten, the attorney, sent me a letter that was half apology and half request to settle. Faye sent back a counterclaim for trespassing, property damage, and recovery of legal fees. The HOA's insurance eventually paid out $38,000 to cover damages, survey costs, and my attorney's fees. Brenda personally owed another $12,000 in fines for unpermitted construction, which the county enforced to the dollar. But here's the part of the story I like telling best. After the dust settled, literally, because that mud flat took a few weeks to dry out. I sat down with the new HOA board. A guy named Marcus, a retired high school principal, had taken over as president. He came to my cabin with 2 other board members, and they asked, simply and respectfully, whether there was any way the community could have some form of access to the lake. I said yes, because that's what my grandfather would have done. Marcus brought a 6-pack of local IPA and a handwritten letter from 11 homeowners thanking me for being willing to talk. That letter meant more to me than the insurance check. It told me the neighborhood wasn't Brenda. The neighborhood was just people who wanted to live near a pretty lake and hadn't been given the full story. We drew up a formal access agreement, reviewed by Faye and the HOA's new attorney. The lake would be refilled. A public fishing area would be maintained on the southern shore, with a proper path built at the HOA's expense and with my written permission. The agreement included liability waivers, maintenance responsibilities, and a sunset clause that renewed every 5 years. It was fair, it was legal, and it was built on respect, not theft. I also did something Granddad would have loved. I used part of the insurance settlement to establish a small scholarship at the local high school, the Wallace Hollowell Conservation Scholarship, for a graduating senior interested in environmental science, water management, or civil engineering. The first recipient was a kid named Jordan, 17 years old, sharp as a tack, who wanted to study freshwater ecology at UT Knoxville. He came out to the lake that fall with a notebook, a pair of borrowed waders, and the kind of curiosity that reminded me of myself at that age. I spent an afternoon teaching him how the dam worked, the way the clay core holds against hydrostatic pressure, how the spillway prevents overtopping, why the valve matters. He asked better questions than most engineers I've worked with. Reggie came by a few times that winter too. We'd sit on the porch, watch the lake slowly refill as the autumn rains came, and talk about nothing in particular. One evening he told me he'd gotten a holiday card from Brenda. It was a real estate listing. She and Dwayne had put their house on the market. They were moving to Florida. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and watched the water. The lake refilled over the winter. By spring, it looked exactly the way it always had, blue and calm and full of bass. Families walked down to the southern shore on weekends. Kids threw rocks from the bank. Old men sat in lawn chairs with their lines in the water, waiting for a bite. And if you stood on the ridge at sunset and looked west, you could see the stone spillway where it all began. Quiet, solid, doing what it was built to do. So if your HOA has ever tried to claim something that wasn't theirs, if they've ever used your money on their ego, if they've ever mistaken a clipboard for a crown, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit that bell, because next time, I'm going to tell you about the HOA president who tried to ban a veteran's flagpole, and the entire town showed up with 200 flags. You don't want to miss that one.